In this video, we're going to try to answer the question about what awakening involves, or one of the aspects of it. In particular, is the Buddha supposed to be omniscient in the early texts? It's a matter of some controversy. Over the years it has been, and we'll try to delve into that coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click the bell down below and put on notifications if you want to be notified when I come out with new videos. And also, if you're interested in a deeper dive into these kinds of topics, check out the courses over at onlinedharma.org. Awakening, nirvana, what some call enlightenment, is the goal of Buddhist practice, and indeed it has been ever since the beginning. And the way this is ordinarily defined, or one way that we understand this state, is to say it's the overcoming of greed, of hatred, and of ignorance. And what we're going to do in this video is to look at that last bit, that ignorance, and what it means to overcome ignorance. And so what we'll do here is first we'll look at that, what ignorance might mean, and then after looking at ignorance and considering it a little bit, we're going to look at how that applies to the person of the Buddha in particular. In one of the early suttas, Sariputta, that is the Buddha's most senior disciple, or his most accomplished disciple in wisdom, discusses a bit of this and says that ignorance is one of the main defilements of the mind, the things that we're trying to overcome. And he says that it's one of the three defilements, along with a sense desire and the desire to be reborn. And indeed, not only that, but rather that all the defilements originate from ignorance. So it's in some sense our lack of knowledge about the way things are that leads to us wanting to become reborn, or we might say wanting to exist forever. And it leads us towards grasping after sense pleasures, wanting things that will stimulate our senses, which in fact, if we know in more detail, are really not the kinds of things that we necessarily want to grasp onto so hard, but that's just part of the way the mind works. Indeed, also, ignorance is one of the standard, what are called underlying tendencies of the mind, along with our underlying tendency towards greed, our underlying tendency towards anger, and our underlying tendency towards viewing the world in terms of me and mine, this kind of egoistic type of thinking. All of these are underlying tendencies, and we might even say that ignorance is sort of the dominant underlying tendency that keeps us locked into samsara, that this is the basic problem that we find in early Buddhism, and indeed in all of Buddhism, is this kind of ignorance about the way the world works. But maybe we can see the problem here. If to become awakened we have to give up ignorance, does that in some sense mean that the Buddha, and indeed perhaps even all awakened beings, have to become omniscient, have to know everything, since they've overcome ignorance? And indeed, in one place in the early suttas, in the Itivuttaka, which is a collection of early texts, there's one passage where it says that in order to become awakened, you have to know all. And what could that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean we have to be literally omniscient? We have to know the past and the future? Now we'll come back to this at the end of this video and try to discuss that a bit. Now this may seem to some of us to be a very strange kind of question to be interested in. It may seem obvious to us that the Buddha was not omniscient, that he couldn't have been omniscient, that omniscience obviously doesn't have anything to do with awakening. But to be fair to many others of us, perhaps some of you watching here, being omniscient was a character of the Buddha, or considered to be characteristics of Buddhas. It certainly in many traditions of Buddhism, omniscience is, at least in some sense, considered part of what it is to be a Buddha. Perhaps this is even higher than being an awakened being. In some varieties of Buddhism, there is a sense of being a Buddha which is even greater than being someone awakened. But however we make that distinction, omniscience may come up here sometimes. Now, the scholar of early Buddhism, the very great scholar of early Buddhism, Analayo, he's a Western monastic, has a very interesting and I think thoughtful paper on this topic, on the topic of omniscience with respect to the Buddha. I'll put a link to the paper down below. And what he discusses in this paper is that there are a number of places in the early texts where it's clear that the Buddha is not omniscient, is not being portrayed as omniscient. For example, in one passage, the Buddha goes out begging for food, as was the norm. That was how the monastics and the Buddha himself got food, was that they went out and on alms round and asked for food. And he said, and one day, he went out for alms round and nobody gave him anything. This would happen from time to time. In another sutta, another early sutta, in fact, a number of them, it's discussed how the Buddha's cousin Devadatta was ordained by the Buddha in the Sangha and became a very senior monastic, but then attempted to kill the Buddha and attempted to split the Sangha and made a lot of difficulty in early Buddhism for both the Buddha personally and the Sangha in general. And in a third passage, it's discussed how the Buddha gave a talk to monastics on the unbeautiful character of the body, because, he knew that many monastics, especially young monastics, were very attached to their own physical body, and perhaps even the bodies of others. And so part of ordinary monastic practice was to have certain meditative practices that would tend to wean you off of this kind of attachment to the physical body. And after he gave them this instruction, the Buddha then went off on retreat, on a long retreat in the forest. And a number of these monastics apparently took this instruction incorrectly. And as a result, a number of them committed suicide because they became so despondent after these kinds of meditations. And when the Buddha returned, he was very disturbed by this fact, and then he gave new instructions to the monastics who remained. And in all three of these cases, the case of going on alms round and there not being food, the case of Devadatta, and this last one, these are clearly cases where the Buddha is portrayed as not knowing what was going to happen. He brought Devadatta into the Sangha not knowing the trouble he was going to cause. He gave the talk to the monastics without knowing the kind of reaction that they would have, and so on. Now, to be fair, there are going to be methods that certain kinds of people, traditional believers of a certain stripe, will try to give to these to say, well, the Buddha may have known anyway and decided to do this for other reasons. And of course, that's always a possibility, but we don't find evidence of that in the texts. In other words, it's not portrayed that way in the texts. It's not said that the Buddha knew this was going to happen. It's portrayed rather the Buddha did not know. And so that's one thing we can. Another thing we can say is that kind of reaction sort of strains credulity a little bit. And there are many other suttas as well in which the Buddha is portrayed as not being omniscient, as not obviously knowing the answers to certain questions he was asking, or facts about the people that he was interviewing, and so on and so forth. Now, it's also, I think, very important that at one point, one of the suttas, the Buddha is actually asked, do you claim to be omniscient? And the Buddha denies that he claims to be omniscient. What he says is that by omniscience, or by knowing everything, or by overcoming ignorance, what he means is that he has what's called the three knowledges. The three knowledges are knowledges that he claims to have achieved on the night of his awakening. And these are knowledge of his own past lives, the knowledge of the action of karma in the world, the way karma works, and third, and most importantly, the knowledge of his own awakening. That is, that he claimed to know that he had overcome greed, hatred, and ignorance, that he knew this absolutely, that there was no question in his mind. And so it's these three knowledges that are the hallmark of the Buddha's knowledge. So while some of us of a more secular bent may put to the side questions about rebirth, about the Buddha's knowledge of his own rebirth, we may put to the side as well questions about active karma working in the world. We may not know about that. And indeed, many of us may also be up in the air about whether true awakening is ever really fully possible, because we haven't seen it for ourselves. We're merely taking it on hearsay from other people. We may put these on the back burner as being questions that are not answered, or perhaps we don't believe in some of them and are willing to accept others. It depends upon the person. But in any event, whether we accept these three knowledges of the Buddha or not, Nevertheless, it's true that they don't constitute omniscience in the literal sense. They don't, in particular, imply that the Buddha knew the past completely and the future completely and knew what was going to happen and knew everything in the world that was happening at the same time and in different places. He might have had supernatural abilities. He claims to have supernatural abilities that will allow him to see certain things, but none of this implies, even if we take it seriously, none of this implies that he knows everything. But then to return to our question from before, what is this all that we have to know to become awakened? What does it mean to know all in this context? And as Analio says in this paper, and I think this is pretty clear, the all that's supposed to be known is a sort of a penetrative insight into the character of reality, into the character of our experience. And in particular, it's this penetrative insight into the fact that the Four Noble Truths are true of all experience, that all experience is, in some sense, unsatisfactory, and that its unsatisfactory nature is due to our grasping at things, our tendency to cling to parts of the world, and that there's an escape from this with the right practices. That's a way of understanding this in terms of the Four Noble Truths. We can also say, in terms of the three characteristics of experience, that this kind of knowledge of the all means to know that all experience and all reality, as so far as we know it, is change, is changeable, that all things change, that all experience is, as we say, unsatisfactory, in some sense suffering, that even positive and happy and pleasurable experiences come to an end and must do so, and to know also that all experiences are non-self, that we cannot find a permanent, unchanging self anywhere we look, that anything we look at and see and experience is not ourself. So this all that we're knowing as an awakened person, or as a Buddha, let's say, this all that we're knowing implies a kind of knowing all, which translates literally to omniscience, to know all. But it doesn't literally mean omniscience in the same way that we generally use it in, let's say, Western theology or something. It means rather this penetrative understanding that all experience is of a certain kind, that all the world shows itself to us in a certain way. And to be fair, many of us may feel that we know these things already. Many of us who, let's say, have a practice of long-term, or it maybe even just have read a lot about Buddhism and find that it speaks to us, we may say, yeah, I know this already. I know that all things change. I know that all of my experience is always changing. I know that life in some sense is unsatisfactory, in the sense there's no permanent refuge in the pleasures of the senses and so on. And I know that nothing that I see around me is myself, that a self is something always mutable and changing and somehow created in the moment. We may think that we know these things, and yet we're not awakened. So there seems to be something of a problem here. And the problem is that there is a very deep difference in Buddhism between what we might call a conceptual knowing, conceptual knowledge, and the knowledge that's really being spoken of in these kinds of passages when it comes to awakening in particular. Because we can know something conceptually, but basically what we're doing in that case is knowing it in a very superficial way. That is, when push comes to shove, our emotions don't agree with our concepts. We find ourselves emotionally linked to a sense of self in the world, identifying ourselves with things, even though conceptually we know that they aren't that way. We find ourselves emotionally feeling that things should be permanent, in the sense that we're distraught when people die, or when things pass away or change. Or we may at times think, now I've found it, now I find the secure refuge, when we get a new house, or go to a new vacation, or buy a new car or something, or whatever, buy whatever it is we've found today on Amazon. And that is an example of that quote-unquote knowledge that we have not really percolating down to our underlying tendencies. That is, our underlying tendencies are still mired in ignorance. They haven't been sufficiently changed yet by our practice. And so one of the things the Buddha is pointing to in these kinds of passages is that what we need to do is to change these underlying tendencies. And by doing so, we'll become the knowledge that we claim to have in a superficial level becomes much deeper and really transformative knowledge. Now, I have an earlier video on these underlying tendencies and their role in what we might call the unconscious, really these kind of subconscious drives that push us on in ways that are not so skillful. And I'll put a link to it here up on the screen. You can click over and watch it right now. I would suggest doing so. It's something you might enjoy and get something out of. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, all of you be well.